Let's talk about props some more. In the previous video, we discovered how elements as props can be useful for creating components with minimal configuration. But this pattern can't solve everything for us, at least not easily. Why is that? Is something missing there? Welcome to the Advanced React course, episode 4. Today we are going to look into what the render props pattern is and what kind of configuration concerns it solves that components as props can't, how to share stateful logic with render props and how children as render props look like, why we shouldn't actually do that these days now that we have hooks, and when the render props for sharing logic pattern can still be useful, even in the hooks era. Let's continue with the button component we implemented in the previous video. We have a button component. It accepts a few props, among which is an icon element. Inside this button, we added some default props to this icon based on the button's props. Smaller buttons will now render smaller icons by default, and blue buttons will have white icons. There are at least two problems here, however. First, sharing button state. What if I want to change the button's color on hover and allow people who use this button to modify icon based on that? The state itself is easy to implement, but then what? How to share it with the icon? Another problem, we're actually not as flexible as we think. Our button now commands which prop the icon can have in order for the whole code to work. But what if I want to use a different library for the icons, where the size of the icon is controlled by a font size prop, for example, not size? Our default logic will just stop working with no warning. This is where the render props pattern comes in. Render props pattern is nothing more than a function that returns an element, which we then pass as a prop to a component. It's pretty much the same as a component itself. The only difference is a component function is something that React calls for us, but render prop is something that we call manually. Inside our button, we just grab this function, call it, and render the returned icon where it belongs. Now we can send any data to that icon as a function's argument. We can send the default prop, for example, without using clone element. After that, we can just spread them to the element itself. That will be our default icon behavior. We can override some of them and make the icon different color. Or we can convert them into the props the icon component actually accepts. No hidden magic anymore, everything is explicit. The flow of data is slightly weird, of course, but at least it's traceable and visible now. Sharing state, of course, is not a problem anymore as well. We can simply introduce hover state to the button and pass isHovered as an argument, and then do whatever we want with the state inside the function. Speaking of sharing state, another useful application of the render props pattern is sharing stateful logic. This was very popular a few years ago, and even today some of the old libraries use it here and there. This usually goes in combination with children as props pattern. That one, the one we discussed in detail in the second episode. Since children is just a prop, nothing actually stops us from making that prop a function, same as any other prop. When it can be useful? Imagine, for example, you implementing a resize detector component, a component that has some state, listens for the window resize, and then saves that value into the state. In real life, you would want to share that state with other components, of course. No use to track it and just leave it. Doing this through props would mean that the component that wants to use it would have to maintain its own state for it. Slightly messy and lots of code. Instead, with render props pattern, we can just share that state directly with children, and then just use it to render everything that we need. However, just because we can do something doesn't mean that we actually should. Anyone who's done any coding in React in the last few years is probably thinking something like this. Well, that doesn't make sense. Don't we have hooks for this? And they are absolutely right. Hooks replaced that pattern for almost 99% of the cases. And for good reason. Exactly the same code with hooks can be simplified into this, with the entire logic of a resize detector being extracted into a simple hook. Less code and much easier to understand. So why even learn render props these days then? A few reasons. For configuration and flexibility use cases, as we looked at the buttons with icons example, they are still very valuable. Very large or old projects will have this pattern all over the codebase. It was really popular before hooks, especially for sharing forms-related logic. And finally, it still can be useful for some scenarios even today. For example, when you need to share a state or logic that is tied to a DOM element. A very common example, tracking scroll inside an area. A component with a scrollable div, with on scroll attached to it, and some state to save the scroll position. Exactly as before, only this time it's harder to extract it into a hook. We need to render a div element to attach the listener to, not window. In this case, we either need to mess around with refs, or just use render props to share the scroll value, and use it the same way as before. One thing with which render props can't help us at all is performance. If you remember, in the episode 2, we used children as props pattern to encapsulate state and limit re-renders caused by it. Unfortunately, sharing that state through render props destroys that advantage. Everything here will now re-render every time the state inside changes. If this causes performance problems, we usually can't solve them with composition tricks. It will be finally the time for memoization. Everyone's favorite React memo, use memo, and use callback. We will look into details into those three in the next video.